Let's get started. Can you hear me down the back? Cool. All right. So thanks for coming along to my session, Heterogeneous Development with Visual Studio 2010. This is actually quite a difficult session to present. Firstly, you've got to actually try and remember to spell heterogeneous properly on every single slide. And then also, you're talking about a topic which traditionally Microsoft hasn't done a stellar job with in terms of opening up their platform so developers can work with their systems. Part of that problem is that heterogeneous development, as defined by Microsoft in years past, means it runs on multiple different versions of Windows. All right. I'm going to do a little bit of a geek origin story. That seems to be a bit of a meme around at the moment. Before I came to working with the .NET platform, I was a developer and I worked on a variety of platforms. I didn't sort of discriminate. If it had a compiler, in fact, even if it didn't have a compiler, I would pick it up and play with it. Now, the problem with being a jack of all trades is that you end up being the build master, right? So one of my first sort of build master gigs that I had to do was managing a cross-platform build environment where I literally targeted all of these platforms, as well as Windows. And that's quite a challenge. You know, what I would do is I would leave the office in the afternoon, and overnight would kick off a build, and I'd come in the morning and just pray that all of those machines that were part of the build process managed to work. But for a lot of us that work in the enterprise, that's actually the reality that we deal with. We don't get the choice of saying we only do .NET. You've actually got to work with Java. You've got to work with some legacy Microsoft technology as well. You've got to work with Ruby and all of those tools. You might even be developing iPhone applications. So this session is really about how do we start to break down some of the barriers around getting all of those different technology silos to work together. So let's get into it. Okay, so who works with multiple quite distinct technology platforms in their business? Okay, a few, right? Now, are all of those environments, keep your hand up, if all of those environments share one common version control repository? It's actually, like, what's that, 4 or 5? That's actually more than I expected. The reality is that for software developers and software development teams, typically that sort of headline technology used seems to dictate which ALM solution, what version control system you're using. Seems to follow, you know, so because every team sort of either rolls their own and they pick off stuff off the shelf which seems to work best for that particular technology. That's not a bad thing, but it means that as a team, we're not actually getting the most out of collaborating. All right. So this session starts to look at some of those issues and how we can actually start to come together in terms of a team and actually have consistent reporting and tracking, as well as just consistent version control and build environments. So I would argue that if your development silo only does version control, you're living in a shack. Right? It's not. You can be doing better. And so often development teams talk about, you know, let's go and do continuous integration. But the reality is if all you do is version control and continuous integration, you know, it's certainly a lot slicker, but your standard of living isn't actually that much better. What we're talking about in this session when we talk about heterogeneous development is actually how you can fully integrate those technology silos into one team. Okay. So that's where application lifecycle management comes in, and that's where Microsoft's application lifecycle management tools come in. So when I talk about application lifecycle management, I'm not just talking about version control, build automation. You know, a lot of organizations do test automation as well. I'm talking about the whole suite. So managing your workload and getting visibility across your projects for, you know, project managers. One of the scenarios that I see play out fairly regularly is if you've got two organizations, you've got the open systems guys and you've got the .NET developers, but they're all working on some combined corporate initiative. And the project manager comes up to each individual team lead and says, where are you guys at? And they say, oh, we're 80% complete. And then he goes to the other guys, and they say, oh, well, we're 80% complete too. All right, so he does his back-of-the-envelope calculations. But what's really happening is that the 20% that they're waiting on is on the other teams, and he's got no visibility of what he needs to do to actually unblock that work. So in order to solve that problem, you need to get the teams not just checking their source code into a common location, you actually need them tracking their work in a common location. Okay. But before I get into the way Microsoft solves this, I want to tackle this concept of professional preference around the tools that we use. Who works in an organisation that practices agile development? Okay. Who practices waterfall? Okay. Who practices no process whatsoever? That's my definition of the right. What's left? Okay, so I think one of the best things that happens to the software industry, and I guess it's a matter for the debate, but I personally think agile development is the way for most organisations to go. But there's a bit of a pitfall in agile development, and there's this concept that a software development team has free rein to choose whatever tools they want. And that belief comes from this little document here. I'm sure a lot of you have actually seen it. And that top line there kind of says it all, individuals and interactions over processes and tools. I actually completely agree. But I think a lot of people read that first line and forget to read the second paragraph, which is that the other things are still important as well. And in fact, if you do those other things well, they can actually contribute positively to those interactions and building working software and getting better customer collaboration. So if I was to redraft that manifesto, I would say that all those things are important, but these other things are still important as well. We just need to figure out a way to do these without compromising those key tenets of agile software development. I've often had development teams tell me that they're going to go off and use tool X because that's the one that they like. If you boil it down, it's what they really mean under the covers after they get through all of the objections, at the expense of collaborating with the rest of the organisation. And so what I want to try and encourage you all to do is look at not just how your own development team is working, but how your development team is going to work with other parts of the organisation outside of those 4 people in that cubicle area that are developing the software. Because that directly relates to one of those valuable assets, which is customer collaboration. All right. So let's look at the benefits of a unified ALM platform. When we look at that tenet, which is individual interactions, if you have a good ALM platform, you've got a place to put your user stories, your task breakdowns, register impediments, and do your sprint planning. There's nothing wrong with putting that information into a tool, although in agile software development we seem to have this sort of allergic reaction to doing any data entry. I'm not suggesting that we forget the humble whiteboard. You know, it's actually a great agile tool, it's great for communication, great for radiating information. But we're living in a reality today where organisations are increasingly distributed. So we've had teams at Redify working on projects in Perth where the team's based here in Queensland, or I was going to say here in Brisbane, that's not quite true. They've been based here in Queensland, and I've been in Melbourne, and I wanted to understand what the progress of that team was. And so we couldn't have done it without tools which gave me the visibility. It was either that, using something like Team Foundation Server, or getting a photo taken of the Scrum wall every day, just to find out what's going on with the team, because it wasn't viable for me to fly up to Brisbane every single day. So these are the realities we're dealing with, and that's why I'm very keen to see software development teams working with multiple technologies come together on that one platform. The other problem is that whiteboards are prone to data corruption, right? Usually the kind of system failure we have is the cleaner, right? Comes into the office and they neatly stack all your sticky notes on top of one another in the corner of the office and say, there you go, I've cleaned your whiteboard for you. That's like a disaster from an agile development point of view, because you've suddenly lost all your context around how the project's progressing. You've got to try and figure out from that stack where things are. And that's if you're actually using sticky notes, right? You know, some people just write on the whiteboard. You know, you get complete data loss if someone comes along and wipes it off. So you just got to be wary of using task boards and whiteboards as your only means of keeping track of information. Firstly, you can't radiate that information to a broader community very easily, because the reality is that we're not all sitting in one office these days. And I don't know about you guys, but I actually spend a fair bit of time working from home, and I don't want to drive an hour and a half each way into the city to look at a task board. So I'd quite happily just go into something like TFS or any tool that gives me that view. It doesn't matter what technology platform you come from, I think that's a reality. The next tenet of that agile software development is getting that working software out the door. So pretty much any technology stack or ALM solution you pick is going to give you version control, it's going to give you build automation. But how well does it work with work management, for example? Can we track where this requirement is and how far away it is from going out the door? That's useful information to the customer. And so you need to present that information to the customer in the form, particularly if you're doing agile software development, in the form of sprint burn downs, release burn downs, and tracking velocity. Who has a burn down on the wall in the office that they've sort of manually graphed or they've printed out from Excel somehow? Yep. Okay, who's not brave enough to admit to it? Okay. What I often see when I go and talk to customers about the way they're doing agile software development is they start off with the greatest of intentions, but then someone forgets to start updating the graph. And so a little while into the project, they kind of lose visibility as to how it's going. So using a tool to do that task management and then getting those reports out on a regular basis is a good sort of exercise to get into. One of the things we do fairly religiously with our software development projects is when we provision a project and start doing software development, we actually automatically set up the reports now. And we actually do things like email the sprint burn down to the customer every single day. Who would like to expose their slipping schedule every single day to the customer? All right, it's pretty nervous. But it's amazing how much it focuses people on reporting accurately inside the systems about how they're progressing. Because most people want to impress upon the customer how well the team's working. So we create that feedback cycle. We've had a project recently where our team had dependencies on other parts of an organisation, and still do. And what we did with that particular project was start publishing the impediments report every single day. I think it was something like 8 a.m. the report goes out, and it says, here are the things, here are the tasks that are blocked, and here are the specific impediments we've got. And so this is all about building an engine inside an organisation so that they can rapidly develop and release software, and it exposes those issues quickly. Now, it actually doesn't matter whether that team was using Java, so that we might have been doing some iPhone development, or whether we were doing some .NET code. If that team's all working in the one environment, they're one team and they're reporting consistently. Very important feature. Okay, so once you start doing that reporting, you're actually giving your customer, this comes back to that customer collaboration tenet, you're giving the customer the ability to make informed decisions. I've seen projects where they don't make that information readily available, they're not radiating it broadly enough, and someone might come to you and say, okay, well, what are we going to do next? And I've got no idea, I don't know what's happening with the project. I don't have that information available to me, so I cannot make that informed decision. Let's just wing it and keep charging ahead. Where the right thing to do might be to stop developing that direction, start developing something else because of the impediments that are exposed to the project. Getting everyone working in that one environment allows you to make better decisions. It would allow you to see that scenario where two independent technology stack teams were actually blocked on each other and you had a project deadlock. You can't do that without tools, especially if they're in different parts of the country. So all of these things taken together, if you do this properly, if you do ALM well, your ability to churn things out and respond to the customer demands is actually increased. We obviously use Team Foundation Server internally. We obviously do most of our work in .NET. And we have a case management process where I send an email to the support team, they convert that to a case, and we synchronize that case information across the Team Foundation Server. Earlier this week, on Monday, I was in the office and I logged 2 feature requests / bug requests. One was a bug, one was a feature. And both of those issues were fixed that day and rolled out into production because we were able to implement the change. So we did the work item management, so we had the case inside TFS. We did the version control, so we made the changes. It built automatically because we have a CI engine going. It deployed into the test lab, and then we deployed it into production. And then the case was closed, and I got the feedback that it had actually gone out. From a customer point of view, how many of you can say that you turn around a change for a customer like that inside a day? Most people usually have at least a day or two sort of test cycle. If you have an ALM platform and you have a consistent ALM platform that you use every project, you can start to introduce levels of automation which accelerate your ability to deliver, which increases your ability to respond to change. So this is what a unified ALM platform will do for you. So if we go back to the beginning where I said, Microsoft's vision for heterogeneous software development is it runs on multiple versions of Windows. What is Microsoft actually doing here? What are they doing to make it possible for the Java guys to work with the .NET guys, for example? Well, their first sort of stab at this is introducing a product called Team Explorer Everywhere, which is a plugin for Eclipse. So who uses Eclipse for Java development? Yeah, a few people. Actually, who does Java development, just so I know what the delta is? Okay. That's not too bad. So Eclipse is probably one of the more popular IDEs for doing Java development. And so that's why actually Team Explorer Everywhere originally was developed by a company called TeamPrize. And that first Buildmaster gig that I did, we actually stored all our source code, despite having all those Unix boxes, we stored our source code inside of Visual Source Safe. All right. Decision, don't know. But I was glad when TFS came out. Now, we actually used a product called Source Offsite, which is an extension to VSS, and that was developed by a company called SourceGear. SourceGear created a spin-off company called TeamPrize, which developed TeamPrize, which became Team Explorer Everywhere. And so Microsoft acquired that company and have integrated that into their overall product suite. So Team Explorer Everywhere is considered to be part of Visual Studio 2010. So what I want to do is do a bit of a demonstration of how heterogeneous development works with the Team Explorer Everywhere environment using Eclipse. And to prove it works, I'm going to do it on my Mac. And just give me a few seconds to log in here and change the... Okay. So I've got an incredibly complex Java application, okay, with a rather obvious bug. What I'm running here is the Eclipse IDE. It's basically a Java application. In fact, you can run Eclipse pretty much on Mac OS X or Linux or whatever you want to run it on. Anywhere you can get the Java runtime and a decent UI. And the Team Explorer Everywhere plugin is installed via the default mechanism. So if you go into Help, Install New Software, Microsoft has some instructions on the things that you've got to type in here to make it start importing this functionality into the product. But once it's installed, I can actually connect Eclipse to Team Foundation Server. So Eclipse has this concept of perspectives. So I'm currently in the Java perspective, so I can see my package explorer down the left-hand side. Prior to, ouch. That's because I went to update the software. That's actually the package update and not the actual plugin itself. So I actually moved the plugin. Okay, so basically I get Team Explorer inside Eclipse as you would with Team Foundation Server. Who actually uses Team Foundation Server? Okay, cool. Hey, you can pack out a room with people who use Team Foundation Server. There's a statistic. Okay, so I've installed the Team Explorer Everywhere plugin, and now I have Team Explorer. And if you've used Team Foundation Server, which most of you have, that left-hand side should look pretty familiar. So you've got the standard nodes that you'll find. And so working with work items is as you would expect in Visual Studio 2010. I can drill down, I see my queries, and I can launch a look at the sprint backlog, which is a hierarchical query, so it all works consistently. So you can see all my tasks there. This is exactly the same data I'd get out of Visual Studio. Works just fine. So what this means is that if I've got a project that might, say, have some Android code that we're developing using Eclipse, but it's got a .NET backend, that team can now work together instead of them working in silos. Because what would happen is if you left those people to their own devices, they'd often go off, and the Android guys might use Subversion, the .NET guys might use TFS, and then they'll probably have completely separate work item tracking systems. By creating this plugin, Microsoft created that ability for these guys to work together and report their progress together. And so if I go and look at the sprint burn down, you can see that I can get the statistics. Now, I only started this project yesterday, so it looks like a bit of a burn up. I'm worried about when this project's going to ship. But the point is that you can see that reporting and analytics come through regardless of which tool you're using to connect to Team Foundation Server. The version control is the same. So you have this concept of workspaces. So that would be fairly familiar. And when I flick back to the Java perspective, I have the option to do things with version control. So there's my menu that sort of gives me a similar sort of check-in, check-out experience, and I can go and jump in and view the history of the code and so on and so forth. Fairly straightforward stuff. What Microsoft did with Team Explorer Everywhere as part of this development was also start to think about what their build scenario was going to look like. So if you're doing Java development, you're probably going to be using a build system such as Ant or Maven, or what's the other one that's quite popular? What's another one? Anyone who's doing it? No? All right. The one that I use most often is Ant, because prior to coming to .NET, that was the one that I used. And so I actually have my Ant build file here. Now what you can actually do with Team Foundation Server is configure the build server so that it can actually initiate a Java build. So you install the Java SDK bits on your team build server. You install some power tools which do some of the linkages between MS Build and Ant. And so I can then go into Team Explorer and initiate a build. So I have a build defined here. And you can actually create the builds here as well. So it sort of walks you through the process of doing the integration. I can actually go through and I can say, on a new build definition, trunk, Java demo 2. Standard thing, I can say I want a CI build. You define the workspace so you can scope it appropriately. Select the build controller and a drop location. But then you go through and you select the MS Build proj file that it uses to produce the build. Now, what's different between this and what you'll see in Visual Studio 2010 is that this workflow is actually more like the workflow in Visual Studio 2008, because they made the decision that the integration between Visual Studio 2008 and Ant was kind of more aligned, because the MS Build file is kind of is a logical point to jump across into Ant rather than using Workflow Foundation. And it also meant they didn't need to build a Workflow Foundation editor on Java, which would be a fairly significant undertaking. So that's where some of the differences are in the product. So now I can go in here and I can queue a new build. Now, this Team Foundation server that I'm connected to is in Texas. The build server is in Texas, and I'm just doing this over an internet connection. It's all exposed over HTTPS, which just works nicely. So there's no scenarios here that you wouldn't expect to work. You might get prompted for credentials every now and then, but depending on your operating system, if it caches credentials, it's usually not too bad. So that's off and running now. What this means is by plugging into the same MS Build engine, it's actually possible for me to go and, sorry, apologise for that. That's actually my short password. I'm not joking. That's I have my main sort of, you know how most people use password databases, yeah? Or who uses the same password for the bank accounts as they do for Facebook? Because that's a winning strategy, right? I had to tell my sister this recently. Okay, so while that build's off and running, it's pulling down the view. So it's actually giving me the web-based view instead of the view that you get inside Visual Studio. It's a little bit different. I'll jump across to Visual Studio. Oh, there you go. Okay. So I'm running Mac OS X Lion here, and they've inverted the swipe, so I keep on getting confused. Okay, so you can see here that it's actually run the build, it's compiled it, and it's actually sitting there in the drop location somewhere. If I go and look at the customizations that makes this possible, if I go into trunk, I've got my Java demo code and I've got a build folder. So when I created the build definition, I actually went in and I said, put these files here, because I wanted them to be versioned alongside the rest of my code base. And that's a good practice with Team Explorer Everywhere or Visual Studio out of the box. And if I open this file, so I open this file, so I might open it. Okay. Not sure what's going on there. Probably doesn't have an editor associated with it. There we go. That'll do. All right. There we go. My Mac foo's not all it's cracked up to be. Okay, so you can see here you've got your standard MS build file, and so you've got the standard MS build stuff that you'd expect. It defines the team project. This is kind of sort of the 2008 generation MS build file for team build. But what they do down here is they call out to Ant. So there's a set of power tools, and I've got a link to it in a later slide, which you install on your build server, which allows this particular target to work, this particular task to work. And it passes all this information into that Ant build script, and then it takes care of doing the build. And there are things for doing things like integrating JUnit tests and the like as well. Okay, I didn't write any unit tests in this particular piece of code, but you can see that they've got the hook points there. So that means that if you've got a code base which has a significant amount of JUnit tests, you can run them through your standard Ant build process, get those XML files and transform them into a format that can be uploaded into TFS, and so you get that consistent reporting across all of your platforms. Using a very similar technique to the way you get NUnit test cases going into TFS as well. Okay. So the question then is, that's .NET taken care of, obviously with Visual Studio. That's Java development, mostly taken care of with the Eclipse plugin. What about other platforms? So what they did when they developed the Team Explorer Everywhere plugin is they basically replicated parts of the TFS client API in Java completely. So it's not just a nasty hack. They've also built a set of command line interfaces which drive that API. So you've essentially got the TF command on your non-Microsoft platforms. And so if you've got users who are used to issuing commands like subversion commands, you can train them across to using the TF commands at the command line. But there are other options as well. And I kind of liken this to playing Cluedo. Who ever played Cluedo? Yeah, I loved it. All right. So who killed Android? Well, it was Eclipse with Team Explorer with Team Build, right? Now, if let's say we're doing Xcode development, unfortunately I don't have a demo of this, but if we're doing Xcode development, we'd use Xcode, but we'd look at using SVN Bridge, which is an extension to TFS. You kind of deploy it alongside TFS, and it exposes the Subversion API and then bridges that communications across to Team Foundation Server. So if you've got an IDE like Xcode that can connect to Subversion repositories, well then SVN Bridge might be a way of doing that. It depends on what commands they actually issue, because SVN Bridge doesn't support every single operation that SVN does, but certainly if you've got a workflow that's just sort of standard commits to Subversion, it should probably work. And once you've done that, you've then got to figure out how you're going to build the thing. Unfortunately, these days you can only do builds for iOS applications on a Mac. I'm not sure if you can do it on an X server or not, if anyone knows. I'm not sure off the top of my head. So what you would probably do in that case is you'd set up your team build machine and then you'd do some kind of remote execution to initiate that build process and then pull the files back across into your drop folder. All right, so when you're dealing with sort of cross-platform ALM, you kind of have to figure out the best way of doing it to get that team working together in the one environment. Okay. So tips and tricks, and this is where I'm hoping to get some discussion going, because I know that the scenarios I've come across aren't the most common ones, so I'm really interested to hear what the problems are that you've had trying to get heterogeneous build environments and development environments up and running, and maybe together we can come up with some solutions to those. But tips and tricks just to get us started. Publish your ALM standards. Who has a defined source tree structure that everyone in the team understands? All right, so when you go back to the office, it doesn't matter what version control system you're using, or what platform you're using, get those standards documented. If you're using Team Foundation Server, we have some that you can use out of the box around version control and build automation. So this sort of explains a structure for your source tree with Team Foundation Server. It doesn't matter whether you're doing Java development targeting TFS or .NET development. This will allow you to make the most out of the various features inside TFS without closing them off to you. It's a consistent structure. So I've got a link to this in the slide deck, so you'll be able to pull that down off the portal. But it sort of goes through and it describes those common scenarios and conventions. Obviously, be careful with branching. You can shoot yourself in the foot doing that. But if used well, it can be quite effective. And then obviously we've got the build automation guidelines, which I had up. And this describes naming conventions around structuring your builds inside Team Explorer so that it's very clear, so you can understand, that's a trunk build, that's a particular branch build, and dealing with release management. So we have that kind of documentation in there. Okay. Did I just lose my slide deck? There we go. automate as much as possible. One of the things you might notice when we brought up Team Explorer here inside the development environment was in the root of the project, we've got some documentation. So beyond just creating team projects, when we start a new project, we actually put in some documentation which points back to our intranet, which describes some things that every developer can do to their machine to make sure they can get up and running into the environment quickly. It's very important if you've got an environment which you want to be able to access remotely, because there's a whole bunch of tips and tricks around setting up WebDAV to access drop folders across the internet securely. So automate those team projects, provisioning processes, set up the default source tree structures, all that kind of stuff. And that's a good way to get more out of your ALM tooling. Sort of brings everyone together. If you've got build scripts, so that build script that I had up, that build.xml file, that's actually one that I just grabbed off the internet, and all I had to do was change a few names to make it build my particular package. So build scripts should be reusable, whether it's using the Workflow Foundation build engine for .NET code, or whether it's using NANT and then just linking to that. So I'd recommend coming up with those standard patterns, particularly if you've got Java developers that may never have used TFS before, giving them that set of build scripts that are known to work well within TFS and deal with putting things into drop folders will reduce the friction of those teams working together. And when it comes to that sort of last-ditch integration, don't forget that there is a command line client. I've got some customers that actually use command line client anyway, so they write Perl code, and they've been using Subversion to do their check-ins and check-outs just in the command line via a shell. So it's a relatively straightforward process to get them across to TFS, because all you have to do is replace their commands with the appropriate TF command, so you just write scripts to take care of it. So you can actually migrate. Those guys were running on Linux machines, and it works fairly well. Okay. So let's start talking about some of your scenarios that I haven't covered. Who has to build from mainframes? No. Anyone from Canberra here? I used to live in Canberra. We used to have to deal with that a little bit. You can pretty much build from TFS on any platform as long as you can get a remote command executed onto that platform and pull the files back. All right, so it really comes down to that. What are some of your integration scenarios that you'd like to see dealt with? Who's going to be brave first person? Makefile projects. So on a Unix machine? So you run it on Windows. So that's a fairly straightforward approach. All you've got to do there is you probably use the legacy MS builds the same way NANT does, and you just spawn out to execute make against the make file. All you've got to then do is pass in the arguments to figure out where the drop folder is and pull the results back. And then you might want to figure out how to get your test results back if you are running any testing frameworks. I don't know. Yep. Yep. That's actually a fairly straightforward scenario. Are you doing your is it C and C++ development? Are you doing? Fortran. And what IDE are you using? Okay. Yep. Well, so the team provides plugin would certainly help with the Eclipse guys, so they could actually check in and Emacs is their editor. So you'd use the command line client because that's probably what they're happy with anyway. Any other integration scenarios that you want to have talked about? Yep. 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 I'm not familiar with it, but does that product have any integration with VSS? No. Okay. So you HPUX. Okay. So your option out of the box there is probably going to be the command line client. What does it support natively? Is it No, as the actual storage. Oh, is it? That's sort of like a reporting solution, isn't it? Okay. Yeah, I'm not familiar with it then. Yeah. So often those systems which have their own sort of versioning and storage repository are the hardest to deal with. Yeah. I've seen things like I've seen there's a product called Staffware that did that as well, and they moved that code over. Their new editor is in Eclipse, and so you can use the plugin for that, but you can't use the old stuff. So you kind of somehow extract the assets out of it and put it in version control and figure a way of managing it back into the database. And I'm assuming the database file is accessed concurrently by multiple users. It is. Yep. Okay. Yeah, that's a tricky one, because unless they've got a way for exporting the assets and putting them back in, yep, it may not work actually, just based on what you've told me, unfortunately.
What organisational roadblocks have you had in your experience trying to adopt ALM across a new team?
There's obviously like tool issues, like people changing from one version control system to another. That's kind of like the simple one. The biggest issue I've found is people kind of look at what you can do and they get scared, right? So you can get to this point where you can check in code and be in production in 5 minutes. If you're coming from zero, looking at that looks like it's miles up in the air in terms of where you can get to. So with ALM adoption, it's one step at a time. So do your version control, get build automation, start introducing work item tracking. You can't do it all at once. Pick up a process, do it well, and then start picking up the next ones that come along. One thing that I would watch out for is that if you pick up particularly agile software development and you do it rigidly, so I don't mean chaos, I mean agile software development, it exposes team members. Right? So if you've got team members that don't collaborate well with others, it will show them up very quickly. They're the ones that go dark quite a bit. So, any other general TFS questions? TFS to Oracle for database script management. Quest Software was supposed to be building a plugin for DB Pro, which allowed you to manage your database assets inside Visual Studio, the same way you do with DB Pro. I think things have moved on a little bit since then. A lot of people are now looking, rather than doing asset management for databases by reverse engineering the database, they're starting to look at database migrations, which is probably more in line with what most people do with Oracle anyway, and that they maintain their change scripts and roll them out. So it's certainly possible to check those files into TFS. That's not a problem at all. But it's more about how do you deploy those changes and align those changes with the code that might be relying on that system. But if the Quest software, it may not have actually ended up getting released, but they certainly had a functioning version of it. You could actually point it at an Oracle database and it would sort of build a tree of all the change scripts which define what the database was. And then if you change the schema, it would actually generate the diff script for you. But like I said, I think the world's moved on a little bit and everyone's just looking at database migration. So probably look at one of the database migration tools, put your scripts inside TFS and then run the migration tool to target the Oracle server. That's especially if the database is closely aligned to an application versus just a centralized database for multiple apps. There's a question. There was a company that was saying that they could do it. You can always sort of replay the check-ins because TFS and Subversion are kind of closely linked in the way that they structure their code. My recommendation though would be if you don't need to actively look at the history every day, just do a tip migration. That will be your easiest path. Okay.
What about tools like text editors, Notepad++, for instance?
Yep.
Yes, it's got some source control, it's got visual source safe,
Yep.
But using the power toy that's supposed to bridge to TFS,
Yep.
I haven't got that to work.
Yeah, so, okay, so firstly, if it's not working, just check a few things, but having said that, there are some scenarios where it won't work. So the things I would check are, have you installed the patch which allows the old source safe source control API to talk correctly to Team Explorer? Because there's an additional patch on top of Visual Studio typically. But that API is getting very dated these days anyway, and so it wouldn't surprise me. It was really only ever designed to work with Visual Studio 2003, and then some people managed to get it working with other tools that use that same API. So you're probably going to fall back to sort of the command line, or using source control Explorer inside Visual Studio, and then doing it if you want to edit with Text++, just jumping into it, so it's your default editor inside Visual Studio. So kind of use the two of them. One thing that's coming in vNext, that they've done a lot of work with, how am I going for time? I've probably got peeps, right? One of the things that they've done in vNext is, if you've got your you're introducing this concept called local workspaces, and so you can just edit your files inside Visual Studio, the file system, and the TFS client monitors the file system for changes. And inside Visual Studio, it'll tell you these files have changed. Do you want to add them to your pending changes and check them in? So you kind of use a combination of the two. So I think for those external tool scenarios, that's going to be the best move moving forward. And TFS is coming on, the next version of TFS is coming on pretty hot, so it's looking pretty good. They're calling it TFS 11, but I don't think that really means it's coming in 2011. I would predict 2012. So, in the meantime, it's use Source Control Explorer or the TF client, tf.exe client. More questions? No? No general TFS?